society from its inception has featured the struggle of women to control their reproduction. We've heard from Chris Knight and Radical Anthropology about their thesis that the process of doing so was what caused the human revolution, was what made us human. It is also, I think it's a quote that Karl Marx, referred to originally from Fourier, that the percentage of emancipation of women is a natural measure of general emancipation in society. The means to control your reproduction is vital in ensuring that women have the possibility of real equality. So how do we stand today? Today, there are, quoting figures from the World Health Organization, there are 73 million abortions every year. 3 out of every 10 pregnancies ends in abortion. 60% of unintended pregnancies ends in abortion. But what's very, very important for us to know that out of all of the abortions carried out today, 45% of them are illegal and unsafe. That's almost half of all abortions in the world. Obviously, very many of those are carried out in parts of Africa and Asia and other underdeveloped countries, as they describe them. But also, very many of them are carried out in Poland, in Spain, and obviously now, of course, most controversially, in the United States. Illegal methods in the past have included old wives' tonics and different poisons to take. I'll speak about the measures for illegal abortion in Russia, in the first Soviet Republic, noxious substances, using implements, and even worse. Today, of course, it's made slightly easier by the fact that there are a number of organizations that exist internationally which provide women with the abortion pill. But even then, although it's a lot safer than using Kotak or some other treatment on yourself, the problem is for a lot of women, and this was the situation in Ireland before the law changed, if you take this pill and you have complications, it's very difficult to go to the accident and emergency, because if they know that you're bleeding as a result of a illegal abortion, then many doctors won't help you. And indeed, if it's criminal for a woman to have an abortion herself, she can be prosecuted. So there's nothing easy about illegal abortion, even in today's world. So as well as bans, outright bans on abortion, there are very many restrictions put on abortion internationally. So for instance, Ireland is recently, 2018, we had a referendum, and now we have the provision of abortion at request up to 12 weeks, and then afterwards it's very difficult to get an abortion. This even includes women who will, their babies will be born dead. They can't often get abortions in Ireland, or terminations, I suppose would be more accurate to describe them, because of the fact that there are both doctors who oppose it, and also because the technology doesn't exist to do them. There are also forced waiting times, forced counselling. Also, particularly, this is a problem in the United States, you have to pay, even if it's illegal in your state, you have to pay. All of these create enormous problems, and also they result in a later abortion. So any person who's concerned about the plight of the embryo should think twice when it comes to proposing or fighting for abortion to be banned. So, okay. Okay. Actually, also, it needs to be said that in countries where abortion is illegal, then contraception is often very difficult to source. the two things go together. So if you don't believe me, go and do some research on Texas or any other state in the United States now, or on Poland. You'll find that it's also very difficult to get contraception. Again, this was also a problem in Ireland in the past. The lack of abortion rights doesn't just affect women's health at the time of pregnancy, but also has implications on the kind of health service that women are able to access. So, you know, attitudes towards women and the banning of abortion means that women don't get the same level of health care that they should get. Ectopic pregnancies is one source of enormous problems for women. There are hemorrhages. There are all sorts of problems. So basically, it's not just a technical question, it's a question that affects all aspects of a woman's life and also her partner and children. Being forced to go through a pregnancy in circumstances where, for whatever reason, you feel you cannot do so, is the only other option for a woman who is faced with an unwanted pregnancy, or else to seek an illegal abortion. Okay. In 1917, we had the Russian Revolution, as comrades know. Before the Russian Revolution, none of the political parties of any colour or hue campaigned for abortion rights. There was concern at the time about the impact of Malthusianism, can't say it, on the medical profession. And I think it's very true that many of them saw the problem of abortion as relating only to, like, the great unwashed, and they wanted there to be less of the working class. But also, I believe it would be fair to say that there was an awareness of the fact that abortion was a real problem, illegal abortion was a real problem for women, and that at the time many women were dying at the hands of backstreet abortionists. In 1907, the Pirogov Medical Society, passed a resolution for the bill to decriminalize abortion, and then in the, I think it was 1911, the Society of Criminal Lawyers passed a similar resolution. So, but nothing happened, of course, after that. In 1917 and 1918, there were conferences of working class women and peasant women took place. Even I can say that none of the Bolshevik women had called for abortion before then. There had been, I suppose the attitude was that this was something that could not be dealt with except with the provision of proper health care and childcare and other supports for women, so to allow them to have children rather than helping them not to have children. Anyway, at those conferences, the women who attended made it known to the organisers that this was an issue that had to be dealt with immediately, and it couldn't go on, that their lives were being so severely affected, and that those they represented were too. So what happened then was that there was a decision made to address the problem, and the Zhenotdel, which most commoners will know what it was, but in any event, it was the Women's Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. It began discussions with the Commissar for Health and also the Commissar for Maternity and Childcare. And a female doctor called Leibovich distributed theses along with Samashko, who maybe would be better known, and he was the Commissar for Health in the Soviet Republic. And she was the Director of Maternity and Motherhood Department. So basically, this was their approach. They believed that the essential aim was to provide proper maternity and childcare provision, to collectivise all aspects of motherhood so that women weren't isolated within the home with children and were able to go out and work and take part in political meetings and be as involved as any man in the building of Soviet society. They were against abortion in a way because they saw that it was a harmful procedure, but they believed that in order to stop the illegal abortion trade and the damage to women's health, it needed to be provided free of charge in Soviet hospitals. So I just want to quote here from the initial debate. So basically the representatives of the Zhenotdel had these discussions with the representatives from the health commissariat. So in this quote, Krupskaya sets out the contradictory position that women were in the early years in 1920. So she says, traditional family forms have been superseded by looser ties, and all that is necessary today for establishing a marriage is shared feelings for each other rather than economic considerations. So basically, the family had been replaced by these more mutual feelings for each other. Men and women were not to be dependent economically on each other, or to the truth that women were not meant to be economically dependent on men. But also she said, while this meant more honest relationships, it also had a dangerous side because it had led to an enormous surge in single-parent families. In the past, men or the husband was meant to help with a woman's responsibilities during pregnancy and to share childcare with her. Now the entire burden is placed on the shoulders of mothers, and while the Soviet government was doing its best to build resources for women in this situation, it was only a drop in the ocean. So basically, there had been a breakdown in the traditional family, but it hadn't been replaced with anything viable in terms of being able to provide what women needed. Okay, so anyway, these debates ended in the decree in November 1920, the abortion decree. In the decree, abortion was described as an evil, but society would only see the disappearance of this evil by implementing socialization, etc., etc. So it didn't say that there would be any there was any intention of banning it at any stage, but they hoped that it would fade away in time. Initially, there was a problem with enforcement of the ban, but then in 1924, they set up commissions. The issue from the very beginning was the demand, and nobody really knew whether this was because women weren't having illegal abortions or because women were having more abortions. Obviously, the conditions in society were very serious, and there was a lot of hunger and malnutrition and other problems that people were facing in that period. The new economic policy for women meant a huge level of redundancies. And also around that time, I've spoken about this before, the law changed because there was a recognition of all of these unregistered marriages and how it meant that men were not taking responsibility in the way that they would have been expected to, and there were changes on that. But anyway, this was a problem. Anyway, commissions were set up, and the commissions would basically take applications from women about their need for an abortion and make a decision. They included a representative of the Zhenotdel, a doctor, and a representative of the Department of Maternity and Childhood. So there were various categories of eligibility, and I think that it wasn't done on a moral basis at all, because really it was recognised from their point of view, that abortion was as a result of difficult economic and social circumstances rather than, issues like rape or something like that. Anyway, there was a sliding scale of eligibility. I should say that the decree didn't completely decriminalise abortion. It only decriminalised it if it was carried out in Soviet hospitals by a properly qualified doctor. Women were never to be arrested or charged with anything, but those that carried out the abortions could be. Anyway, it was found, surprisingly, to be a safe operation, but it was a painful one because there were problems with the availability of pain-killing drugs at that time. But although there were complications for women were between 15 and 30%. Those complications also were as a result of their general poor health than necessarily the operation. I think that they did take a lot of care to make sure that it was scrupulously performed. And the number of women who sought early abortions was overwhelming. 99.6% of abortions took place in the first 3 months of pregnancy. The number of illegal abortions continued to be a problem to estimate because they wouldn't be known about unless the women presented to hospitals afterwards for care because they were botched in some way. In any event, some of the statistics show that they dropped to about 24% of all abortions by 1927. Contraception was a problem also at the time. Obviously, they hadn't developed the kind of medications that we have today. Condoms were apparently pretty awful things to use, and many men didn't want to use them. So there was an issue with that, and I think it would be fair to say that sometimes it could lead to women having abortions rather than using contraception, either because she didn't have access to it or because the man didn't want to use it. Okay, so just moving on to the debate. I don't know how long do the time.
20 minutes.
Okay. Now, so in the debate, the initial debate in Communistica, which is what I've looked at, which is the journal of the Zhenotdel, Nadia Krupskaya, who is a leading Bolshevik, argued that the reason that abortion needs to be provided, it was because women did not want to have children in difficult conditions. Again, she talked about this need to eliminate those kind of social conditions and to provide contraception so that women didn't have the problem in the first place. Inessa Armand, another leading Bolshevik who died in 1920, disagreed with that position, and she proposed a slogan. She died in 1920, in September 1920, so unfortunately, she was lost to the whole process at that time. Anyway, so she argued that it was unthinkable that there should be any form of forced childcare labor, that women should be told that they had a duty. Women should not have a duty to have children for socialist society. Samashko, who I mentioned earlier, also wrote in Communistica in that year on the Volny Vopros, which I think it's kind of like a difficult thing to translate because it's the sick question, but I think it would be on the difficult question of abortion. And he argued that doctors should not refuse to assist a woman on conscience issues because this would lead to a woman poisoning herself. They should have regard for the human being. Krupskaya argued against the moral tone of those who spoke about the rights of the embryo, and said that a woman herself knows too well all the difficulties. She's the one that experiences the pregnancy. She's the one within whose body this new entity is developing. She knows, she will know the grief of an abortion if there is to be grief. And so she can't be preached at as though she's some reckless, inhuman being who does not understand what she's doing. So there were also a number of activists at the time in the Zhenotdel who argued that basically that really they couldn't have children because their lives were too difficult. They were too busy trying to bring about change in the Soviet Union, trying to create facilities for women, and that basically they didn't have the physical health or the interest really in doing this. They didn't want to set their time in their life aside in the kind of circumstances that I described earlier. Semashko responded very angrily to this, and he said that basically there was a slippery slope that they could go down where they would let themselves off the hook, and that basically no matter how difficult it was important that women continued to have children and understood that they had a duty to do so. For him, it wasn't a question of individual choice, but a public health issue, and that the Zhenotdel was the organization which was to implement the conditions which would lead to women no longer needing to have this operation. Kollontai, interestingly, a little bit like Zetkin, perhaps even more so, argued at a lecture she gave at the Sverdlov University in 1921 that while women shouldn't have to have children at the time when the difficulties existed, in the future women had a social duty to the state. This is something perhaps that's already known about, but I found it, well, I had read it before, but reading it in the context of this debate, it somehow surprised me. Anyway, she wasn't just opposed by other members of the Zhenotdel, but by a number of doctors. A Russian doctor, Rivkin, wrote that just because a woman can have children, you can't demand that she does so, cannot turn her into a baby machine. In 1924, Semashko was beginning to want to introduce some restrictions. And again, as I've said, this is because of the high level of abortions, because of the fact that the state's health service was unable to deal with them. Another member of the health department, Dr. Jens, he argued that there could be no restrictions and that these will only, again, lead to illegal and dangerous abortions. So just moving on now to look at the debates in 1928, 1929 in Komuniska. So obviously, if we set the context of this debate, it was during the first years of the 5-year plan, which was having an enormous impact on the entire population of the Soviet Union, but most particularly on the peasants who were being corralled into collective farms and factories. And in terms of the experiences of peasant women, they were being, particularly oppressed by this new move. So the question of abortion for peasant women became extremely important. So basically, the contributors to this debate appear to be organizers of the Zhenotdel in the areas of Siberia and other parts of the East. Firstly, there was a report by one of the contributors to a prosecution that had taken place in Siberia, in the town in Siberia, of a doctor for carrying out abortions outside of the health system and charging for them. During the trial of this doctor, women rushed into the courtroom and up to the judge and said, please do not prosecute this man. He is our friend. He helps us. And the prosecution, the court, just ended up in complete chaos. The women did not want him prosecuted despite the fact that he had broken the law, because to them, he was their friend. Okay. There was the development of an idea that this was not a measure just for women who were victims of terrible conditions, but also a question of choice. That was, to me, reading these articles is what's creeping through, that no matter how much restrictions, women will continue to seek an abortion. And if they have somebody who's reliable, then of course they will go to them. The women, particularly women who wanted to go to university or to take part in, some of the available opportunities, and there weren't that many, just did not want to have children, because despite the fact that the society had changed, and despite the fact that there had been some socialization projects, the situation still wasn't good enough for them to be able to do the things that they wanted with their lives. They still had to go home and look after children at the end of the day. So one writer describes the desperation of peasant women, and this is, again, as I mentioned before, during the period of 1928, 1929, peasant women jumping into pits to try and bring about a miscarriage. Interestingly, divorce, which was introduced in Central Asia in 1924, also proved extremely popular. And the thing about that as well, which shows, I think, gives us some insight into what was happening at the time, is that many women who got divorced kind of ended up, not being able to get work or to fit in anywhere else, and ended up in prostitution because the society could not provide what was needed, so the legal rights did not match the availability of options. It wasn't real, I suppose, is that what you would say. So I'm not going to go through all of the problems. I can talk to comrades afterwards, but it was very hard for the Commission to decide who was most deserving in that period. Hospital beds were partly taken up by women who'd had abortions and had complications. There were many calls in the articles for increases in facilities. So here, just to summarize, you had a situation where the head of the, I'm going to call it the health department, was saying, well, look, here we are, we're looking at a situation where perhaps things have improved a bit economically. The law has changed, so now women are entitled to spousal maintenance. And we need to think about cutting back on this. There was a fear expressed by him and others that basically that now that it was available, too many women were taking up the option rather than going through the process of pregnancy. They were opting out. So 1936. So I've spoken about up to 29. So abortion continued to be available throughout the period of up to 1936. But in 1936, the law was changed and abortion was banned. And as we all know, most people will know, this was the Act of Stalin. So I have the act here, but I don't really want to go open my computer and figure it out because it may take too long. But essentially, the 1936 Act was quite effective in a sense, in that what Stalin did was said, the drafters of the Act was approved by him, said, basically, there are now no social and economic problems. Every woman is working, which they were. The joy of motherhood can now be, enjoyed by women throughout the Soviet Union. Now women are economically independent, and Abortion, therefore, would be forbidden, except in the threat to life or serious injury, which generally means not. Women, for the first time since the revolution, or since 1920, would receive the criminal penalty if on their first pregnancy they would get a social reprimand, and then, sorry, on the first abortion, social reprimand, and then the second one, they would have to pay a fine of 300 rubles. In contrast, women who had children could really cash in. So there were allowances if you had 7 children, 2,000 rubles if you had 11 children, 5,000 euros. You got all sorts of additional benefits, maternity, homes, nurseries, kindergartens, etc. So this is very interesting to me, and if someone wants to look at that law, I'll send you the PDF. It's very interesting because it also makes me realize something I hadn't realized before, how it came to be that in the Soviet Union, women had the double burden of labor, but in the workplaces, they generally did have facilities to look after their children. And I would say that this is, this was obviously, it was something that existed in an earlier period, but have been manipulated now in order to ensure women did have children and went to work. So it wasn't liberating them, he was weaponizing the achievement of demands at an earlier period in order to ensure women continued to have children or began to have children. So the birth rate had actually seriously fallen in this period. Basically, by 1930, abortion was outnumbering births in some cities. In 1922, there had been 21 abortions per 100 births. In 1934, there were 271 abortions and 100 births. So obviously, massive issue. We had, of course, the reasons why, I would say, alienation, the process of collectivization, sharp increase in the experiences of persecution, but discrimination against women, famine. So, like what Stalin had done, and not just him, of course, his leadership, had reversed the position of 1920, which said if you ban it, it's going to, if you continue a ban, it's just going to be a continued problem. Now he believed that a ban with all of these new facilities and rewards, and other Russian rewards, would mean that women had children, but actually the opposite was true. The numbers of abortion continued to be high, very high. Despite the ban, women still had abortions. I think in 1940, the numbers of abortions remained at around at least equal to the numbers of births. So they declined a bit, but not very much. So women continued to seek abortions after the ban in very large numbers. I think that was obviously because they had integrated it into their lives as something that they could use, and now that they found themselves in a situation which was even more challenging than in the early years, perhaps, they were just going to do it. So alternative ways for doing it were found, which would most likely have been what they called the babka, who was the midwife, who was able to carry out abortions. Who knows what happened after this? I've yet to study it for women who had botched abortions. That I'm presuming that they would have been arrested, or not arrested, that they would have been prosecuted when they went to hospitals. I don't know what happened with that, or whether they were able to evade it. But in any event, they defied the ban and continued to have abortions, although they were illegal and obviously, in that sense, unsafe. So, just to conclude, the question of abortion isn't if, it's how. Women have and will continue to try to control their own reproduction, and for very many reasons. Clara Zetkin, as she mentioned Germany, but I should say just, yes, in Germany, the women there, organised there, present for the fraction in the Reichstag to present an amendment to the existing law banning abortion, and the amendment was that the ban should be removed and replaced with the commitment to provide provision of proper services, and that if they refused to do that, then they would still campaign against the ban, which I think is quite a good position. They still did have a general view of it being something that would not become necessary as a procedure in the future, but they didn't mention it being curtailed in any way. So I think that the question of abortion today remains the same as it was then. I think in very many ways the approach of Zhenotdel and others was a good one, because as they said, it's something that's needed. Women are going to do it. We may as well provide them with the facilities to do it. Of course, it's not the answer to all your problems. It should be part of a health system which provides all levels and is able to give women the kind of contraception you need, you know, and it links with everything in life, really, doesn't it? It links with every aspect of liberation, to live in a society where you're treated as an equal at the very least. To be able to participate, you need all sorts of facilities and amenities, including when pregnant, because very many women want to have babies. It's not like women don't want to have children, only want to have abortions. Sometimes you do want to have an abortion. Some women don't want to have children. There are all sorts of different reasons for having them. But of course, contraception is a far more preferred option, but it doesn't always work. In any event, I think my main point is that women have to have free abortion limits in order to begin to play an equal role in society. And I think that that struggle still goes on, and even in Britain and in Ireland and in other places that focus of having abortion, the restrictions remain and need to be abolished immediately. That's it. Thank you.